Herkese merhaba. Bugünkü siyah diyalog kapsamındaki yeni medya sanatı kürasyonu ve koleksiyonerliği paneline hoş geldiniz. Moderatörümüz Yussi Parikka, konuşmacılarımız ise August Jordan Davis, Beryl Graham, Ebru Yetişkin, plugin koordinatörümüz ve Haro Cümbüşan. Hoş geldiniz. Size devrediyorum ben.
Teşekkürler. Welcome to our afternoon panel on collecting, curating new media art. My name is Yussi Parikka. I'm a professor at Winchester School of Art, and Winchester School of Art is happily co-hosting this panel with Contemporary Art, Istanbul and the new media, plug-in new media section. I work and teach media and design and art at school in UK in England, but I partly live in Istanbul as well, so I'm happy to be presenting this panel here in Istanbul on also my home turf. We're going to be today discussing and having specialists from a variety of fields discussing of why do we feature new media art in the contemporary art Istanbul context. And we'll bring different angles from curators, art historians and academics, as well as collection and collecting this. So what we're going to do is we have an hour for discussion, and it's going to be more of a conversation, even if there's going to be slightly longer introductions first. But I'll introduce our speakers first, and then we'll go into more conversational mode about new media art and contemporary art in this context. So welcome everyone. But in terms of introductions, let me first, if I go in this direction, I'm going to introduce first a dear colleague from Winchester School of Art, Dr. August Jordan Davis, who's the program leader for a new MA we're running and starting there, MA in Contemporary Curation at Winchester School of Art. August is an art historian and a curator, and she explores the relationship between contemporary curatorial positions and institutional critique, and she works with colleagues and students and alumni and a network of artists and designers in this context. And she's also the director of the Winchester Gallery, the artistic director of the gallery we have on our campus. And there's a variety of recent curatorial works that she's been engaged with, including the Laboratory of Dissent that was commissioned from the Chapel Art Studios, and also a forthcoming Winchester iteration of Amit Jain's Reading Room that travels up to Winchester from India. On top of that, August is an art historian interested in feminist art history and a lot of theoretical topics, and I'm sure also that angle will come through in some ways in today's talks as well. Next, I have the pleasure of introducing Beryl Graham, who's a professor of new media art at the University of Sunderland and one of the leading academic writers having to do with new media curation, so we're especially pleased to have her here today as well. She's the co-founder of a really significant resource, the Crump resource for curators of new media art. And she's curated the international exhibition Serious Games for the Lang and Barbican Art Galleries, and her numerous books include Digital Media Art, and also Rethinking Curating, Art After New Media, and New Collecting, Exhibiting and Audiences. She was a member of the AHRC-funded research network on collecting new media at Tate as well. Next, I have the pleasure to introduce Haro Cümbüşan, who's a collector of contemporary art with a special interest in moving image. He's Istanbul-based, and he's a founding director of something you might already know, the Collector Space, which is a non-profit organization that brings private art collections to public view and promotes these critical discussions and writing contemporary art and collecting practices. Collector Space opened its first exhibition space here in Istanbul in 2011, but he's also on the board of directors of Proto Cinema, which functions both in New York and in Istanbul, and curated some lovely exhibitions in Istanbul as well. And also he's on the board of Studio Voltaire in London, so welcome to you, Haro, as well. And then last but not least, because she is the reason why we're here, and the reason why the Plugging New Media section is here. So Dr. Ebru Yetişkin works at Istanbul Technical University, and she wears at least two hats. One hat is the academic, theorist, sociologist, and writes about media and contemporary culture. And the other hat is represented here. She's the director and main curator of the Plugging New Media section of Contemporary Istanbul. So she's really the person who's able to tell us and glue these various perspectives of what it means that new media functions in this specific institutional context of the Contemporary Istanbul Art Fair. And she's already created a lot of shows in Istanbul, and I'm sure that you've seen some of them already. My favorite of the various ones was Waves, which was, I think, last year at Dalgaran Waves exhibition in Istanbul, but there's numerous others as well. So warm welcome, and thank you to Ebru as well for bringing us all here. So after introductions, I would like us to get started, and in a way, to give us a kind of a ground on which we understand of where we're approaching, because as I said, we got curators, we got slightly more academic perspectives, we got collective perspectives. So I would like to invite you to meditate and kind of think about a bit and share some of your thoughts of what is your angle of approach to new media art, either curating or collecting in this context. And I think I would like to start with Beryl, if you would like to start a bit in terms of telling us a bit more about your angle, because people might not be familiar with your books and your work already, so please tell us a bit more, Beryl.
Okay, I'm going to show you some images because I kind of hate it when curators just drop names like you're supposed to know who they are. So I'm going to show you some pictures. So, my interest in collecting new media art is because I'm really excited by the art itself, so it's great to be here and see all the great art that Ebru's curated downstairs. And the work is being collected. Some people think it might be uncollectible, but the curator Steve Dietz says that collecting new media art is just like anything else, only different. So I would try and pick out the ways in which it is different. As you can see, new media art is not just now, it has a history and it relates to lots of different art movements. Steve Dietz says that new media art is different from old media art in three ways. And it's the kind of ways in which the work behaves. There's connectivity, there's interactivity, and there's computability. I'll give you a few examples from each and then go on to talk about how collecting it makes it different because of these behaviors. So, connectivity. Things connect to other things. In this case, it's Marcel Duchamp and John Cage playing chess, which connects to sound modifiers, which actually goes to make a sound piece. So you can connect in one room, you can connect across the planet via the internet. So what it means for curators is thinking about, is this work live? Does it matter if the liveness is broken, if the connectivity is broken when you collect a work? There's also computability. Computer software is generative. An artist might make some software which at the start does one thing, but because softwares can learn, like here, the movements of these computer arms learns from the movement of the gerbils in the glass box in the vitrine. And there's some works downstairs where software is involved, which generates poetry, for example, in one of the works. So what happens if the software that you start with isn't the same as the software ends up, which might be the case for certain works. And then there's interactivity. In this case, the interactivity might be between the audience members who are sitting on the beanbags. This is a radical act for a curator to have beanbags in their gallery and also to think that maybe people will talk to each other as well as sitting in silent contemplation of an artwork. So, for curating and collecting art now, one of the things about connectivity relates to this work, Thompson and Craighead, the number of miles traveled through the solar system this year and the number of barrels of oil remaining it's just projections of numbers into a gallery space. It's a very conceptual work, but in the case of the Harris Museum and Art Gallery, which is a medium-sized museum in the north of England. It's a very old-fashioned traditional museum, but it has a curator who has collected video work and now new media work, software work. And this is called an experiment in collecting digital art, because first they had an exhibition of 8 or so new media artworks, and then they had a panel who would select one of those works for the collection of the museum. And they also had an audience vote. So the people's choice, people could vote in the gallery or online. And actually the expert panel and the audience choice selected the same work. They both agreed, even though this is a rather conceptual work, that people very much responded to it. So this work is now in the collection. So what happens if you collect the work and then the live data feed to those sources of the numbers is broken somehow? Well, the artist made a package for the museum so that it was a whole list of different data sources for the number of barrels of oil remaining, so that this work can be preserved into the future, so that at any time it can be shown. And even if one website is down, they can link to another website to keep the live connectivity of the work going. Another work which exists for free on the internet, but has also been collected, is Ruk Kojik's work. And the curator, Caitlin Jones, curated a show for the Selling Gallery in New York, who were selling a whole range of different new media works. So this work, although it's for free on the internet, they also sold as a package. So what you got was a CD and a signed certificate by the artist. And in this way, private buyers were willing to pay reasonably small amounts of money to collect this work, which was actually freely available to everyone. So new media work is collectible, even though it's not always live on the internet. This is Casey Reese's work. There again, there's some work in the exhibition from Dam Gallery. And in the V&A Museum in London, this is shown on a large plasma screen. And also, what is actually physically in their collection is a metal box with some CDs and some sample printouts from the images, which change all the time. And some of the CDs are not to be opened. But what Casey Reese does is version his software. As you can see, it's called Process 18 Software 3, so that it's like versions of commercial software. You might get Photoshop 4.1. So as he updates the software, each image will be different anyway, but he recognizes that there will be versioning of his different works. So as well as purchasing an edition of the work, the collector knows exactly which version of the work that they have in software form. So, interactivity. Sorry, I should have said that the Casey Reese example was about computivity. If you're collecting software, you can version it. Interactivity, that's interesting. San Francisco Museum of Modern Art had a show called The Art of Participation, and the curator, Rudolf Freeling, talks about performing a collection, so that works which might have performative elements, or like conceptual art, might be just a set of instructions of what to do to show this work in the future. So interactive works are quite often, there's a lot of documentation about, okay, so what is the intent of the interaction in this work? And as Rudolf is pointing out here, quite often that documentation is done by the audience and not by the curator. So all of this stuff online about people using this Irvin Verm work in the exhibition are now online and are telling the curators a lot about how people behave in the gallery space. Also, this interactive work by David Rokeby, the giver of names, is collected, and the researchers Lizzie Muller and Caitlin Jones have done a great deal of documentation around this, including interviews with audience members. The audience becomes very important in the documentation. So if this is intended to be an interactive piece, what kind of interactive experience did the audience have? And this is documented and recorded as part of collecting these works. So what might curators in the future need to know about collections? We run a one-week short course in London for curators after new media art. And we take them to the V&A collection. The V&A does have a collection of early computer art. And we discuss with a lot of the curators there about how to keep these collections alive, you know, what it is that's collected, how you get that documentation together so that these things can remain alive, remain connected, remain interactive into the future. So that's one of the intents of the book, also to stress how important the audience is for collecting these kind of behaviors. And to try and go on into the future to make sure that this really dynamic art form can be collected. That's it. Thank you. I just wanted to show you some examples that maybe
I
could be
think it was
discussed.
a really great way of starting because it gives us an idea in terms of actually the art historical contexts in which new media art emerges slowly and then kind of weaves into issues about curating and collecting. So that's why I would like to ask next Haro to talk a bit from the collector perspective as well. Would you like to kind of continue on from, you know, about the angle that you're approaching these things?
I can try. I cannot make any promises, but that was an excellent overview of the field, and I love participating in this kind of panels because this gives me the opportunity of actually listening to people who know what they are talking about and not being distracted by a phone call or something. Well, last night I was thinking about what I could talk about, and was thinking that maybe we could show some examples from our collection. And as usual, I left that to the last minute a little bit, but the advantage of having media works is that, you know, I don't have to go a storage facility and look through, you know, big paintings. Many of the works are stored virtually that I can access from anywhere, at least in theory. Actually, we did try that here, and it could have worked, but I decided not to push technology too hard because you never know, it can strike back, and you don't want to be in that position. So I was looking at a piece by Zibran Festig. A difficult name. He's an artist that I really like, based in New York. And this particular piece was very simple. The classic Coca-Cola ribbon, red on a silver background. I guess it's Diet Coke. And news is collected from different sources on the internet and slowly fed through that ribbon in the classic Coca-Cola typeface. And I got it started because, you know, with this kind of work, with technology in general, you cannot assume that, you know, because you left it working, you know, a week ago or a month ago, it will still be working when you try next time. But in this case, it started fine, and it said news updated 5:28 p.m., I guess New York time. Hollande column, 60 people dead in Paris, slowly came up. And you know, it took me a few seconds to realize what it was saying, and I tried to keep it calm and put my laptop down, turn on BBC, and kind of realize what was happening. And you know, with that in mind, you know, I cannot, you know, help but question the, you know, how relevant it is what we are talking about today, given all the things that are happening around us. But on the other hand, I mean, certainly we expect a lot from art, and so we have to give it the benefit of the doubt that it can address some of the issues. In this case, you know, the work was produced about 10 years ago. It was a criticism against the commoditization of news media, I guess, and how we consume it. But in this case, it was maybe the most effective way of delivering that news. And what painting can claim that kind of feat? I don't know. So from that, I'll jump into your question of why we have a new media section in an art fair. You know, I think the medium of the artwork that is produced is pretty much irrelevant. It's what it says, the ideas behind it that make it an important piece, a reference piece that survives over 20, 50, 100 years and becomes part of art history. I mean, I have nothing against the other media, the traditional medium, painting, sculpture, but the key thing is that, you know, would you prefer to have a painting on your wall that, you know, unless, you know, a bomb drops on your house, it will be there, you know, in 80 years, the way, you know, pretty much it is today. But, you know, after you put it above your sofa, it will not have that much to say to you or to anyone else, versus a piece that, you know, has some complication. It may, you know, you don't exactly know what will happen to it in 20 years. When we acquired this work by Zibran, you know, I was pretty sure that in 20 years there would be no internet to get the information. I may be wrong. I mean, we have already been 10 years and it still works, which is, you know, good news for me. But I was pretty confident that we would find some ways of addressing that issue of, you know, how do we preserve this work? And there's a lot of work going on to address that. And even if not, I think being part of that discussion to me was very interesting. So now maybe we see media arts, performance art, something a bit different from contemporary art that we see in art fairs. In my mind, that is the mainstream contemporary art today. That's where a lot of the interesting works are being produced. That's why I look at those works. And I appreciate contemporary Istanbul that they made this presentation possible, that gave everybody the possibility to create an exhibition. Now it may look like it's black and white, you know, the main space is white and the new media space looks black, so it looks different, but let's ignore that kind of difference. It's actually, that is contemporary art in my opinion.
Excellent. There's a lot of things that I want to, and we want to pick up on what you already said, and it's clear what you also ended up with, is that a lot of new media art practice, also what we see downstairs, is able to push a lot of social agendas that are most crucial to us at the moment, having to do with surveillance, having to do with other sorts of technological but also social and political issues, and that's something crucial, and that makes it also interesting in terms of collector point of view. That's probably also kind of the connection and bridge I want to lead up to August Davies and kind of share us some of your thoughts as an academic but also a curator and a specialist in this field. So.
Thank you.
Yes, well, I think you've both brought out some really interesting aspects of what we're looking at today that really form the crux of why are we even questioning the viability of new media collection and curation, and are there special concerns and considerations that we have to abide by when we're addressing this very contemporary type of work. And something that Beryl mentioned that I thought was most interesting was that kind of overlap between, for instance, software version limited edition, and which sort of edition might you get, and how this intersects with a very traditional notion of the limited edition print or photographic print, so that again we can see a continuity of concerns around medium specificity that comes from more traditional media and bears upon new media in its relationship to us as either gallerists, curators, collectors, art historians, academics, who are accustomed to not just looking at objects, but very much in the post-conceptual art legacy moment, looking at procedural works, at process, at the idea that we've transcended the notion of the singular object as the object of study, and instead it's very much these performative and interactive works that we have to deal with anyway in the post 1960 moment to now, as people who are interested in not just looking back and reflecting and writing perhaps academic considerations or criticism of these works, but to think of them as continuingly vital artistic expressions, that we want to have an interaction with something that we see as indicative of our contemporary moment, and that therefore needs to retain its vital elements. So I think this idea of how we keep these things alive, especially when we're looking at new media and questions of software and hardware obsolescence, and then the archival impulse, how do we address our role as curators who have this kind of duty of care for works? How do we actually stage them appropriately now, but ensure in our collecting methods or in our curatorial collection methods that we're going to keep the architecture alive that will support these works? So I think these are really interesting questions that you don't necessarily have to the same degree or in the same way with painting or sculpture or printmaking or photography that you do have with not even video art necessarily, but works that are much more reliant on these interactive and translation moments. And the idea of how do we utilize these works going forward, to me as a curator who's working all the time with a variety of researchers, designers, to stage exhibitions and events that transcend specific medium pathways. Instead, they're very intermedial works. It causes you to reflect on the fact that new media helps us actually, as curators, step back and recognize the gallery itself as a medium. And it really offers us an interesting opportunity to look at the sorts of questions around interactivity and audience participation and performance art and the challenges that these can traditionally offer the gallerist as challenges that bring opportunities of their own, that give us the chance to recognize the operations of the gallery space. And even when we think about work being sited or situated outside or beyond the gallery or online, we still have that relationship to the gallery as this kind of formative medium. And I think for me, in the way that I've been commissioning work recently, this has been the really kind of critical kind of switch that flipped, is to recognize that in a way, all of our contemporary work becomes this new media that challenges this traditional status quo about the relationship of the gallery as the support architecture for contemporary art stagings. So we were very lucky to have a group in Hampshire in England, in the part of the country where we're based at the Winchester School of Art, that has a well-funded local arts group called the Chapel Art Studios. And they're actually based in a deconsecrated chapel that was once a dissenter's chapel. So this is a part of Protestantism that is very much set on dissenting from canonical readings and teachings. And when they realized that the space that they're situated in has this relationship to dissent, they were very interested in exploring the notion of dissent as a working practice within their contemporary arts making. and how they, as a group of affiliated artists who are about 24 in total, how do they proceed when they have very different interests as artists and very different medium backgrounds? How do they bring this together into a new way of working? So I was very interested in thinking about Rancière and dissensus and thinking about Chantal Mouffe's agonisms, looking at participatory art in the lens that, say, for instance, Claire Bishop talks about in Artificial Hells, that tries to look at this dissensual way of working, that you don't have to force consensus, that instead it might be more productive to have this disagreement, this uncertainty, and that you could work with this as a methodology. So I commissioned them to do their first project exploring dissent as a working method, and we came up with this idea of the laboratory of dissent. And I know Beryl's written a lot about this idea of the laboratory model for the gallery, and how this can be productive, but also can lead to kind of quite trite conclusions. So I wanted to see it very much as, how could we use the laboratory in a non-instrumental way, so that it could be this productive way of interrogating the gallery as media. And so we had 4 weeks of artist residencies. So the group of artists split into these cells, and each took a week's turn to do a work within the umbrella of the laboratory of dissent, but each week had its own specific theme. And they would interrogate questions around the institution of the gallery, ourselves as a specific gallery institution, looking at the ways of collaboration. The second week were women who were all migrants and mothers and artists, and they interrogated the notion of domesticating conflict. And we had a great interaction of themes around occupation in all of, the myriad meanings that that can offer up. Also about how you can dissent amongst this group that's collaborating on something with me as their commissioner, but also potentially as a provocative, standard of the institution, that then they're going to rebel against me. They were provoking each other week on week. The occupying mothers had a tent and a big banner set up in the gallery for each of the 4 weeks, and they kept interfering with the other week's thematics. So the whole gallery itself became this active circuit of dissent, and how could our expectations of each other be challenged, and yet we could find ways of recuperating those moments of dissent that could have exploded the whole project, and could recuperate them in a positive fashion to have a kind of dissensual, laboratory that would lead towards something. It was a 2-day symposium at the end that allowed us to assess how well this had worked. And I think it was really so productive for everyone in this to recognize that we could go and take this methodology and this way of interrogating the medium specificity of the gallery forward and move it on to new productive lines. We also have, we're very lucky to have had a PhD student with us, Walter Van Reen, who recently completed his work with the Winchester School of Art, but also with Rhizome's art base at the New Museum in New York, and with the John Hansard Gallery, which is part of the University of Southampton. And his work was very much looking at these questions around archive and software sustainability, the idea of a dispersal process for his art practice. So rather than making objects, how could he make something that was going to intentionally live only within some kind of distribution network, some kind of online life that wouldn't have necessarily a material space? And then how would we bring this into the gallery and show it in a way that keeps it alive, but the process is also keeping alive archives of what the Hansard stages, which is artwork around the legacy of conceptual art. So he was digitizing all of the shows that they had done in the 2000s that they had no archive for, and he was recording all of this information in a very standardized format and creating a database that they could then use in a variety of ways, but was also projected, and that this itself was a part of his artistic practice. So it wasn't just his role as some kind of voluntary archivist, but that performance, that persona, was actually his practice. So I think all of these are really interesting ways of considering how we struggle with new media to keep it alive and keep it current and flourishing, but how we can also learn from that in our own methodological practice as gallerists and as artists and artists as curators.
True. Again, you raised really a lot of urgent and interesting kind of a context and terms and kind of practices that are relevant. You mentioned laboratory, which is kind of already a term that ties in art and science in such kind of a, intimate ways. And I know that, Ebro, you've been interested in trying to address these kind of things of how do you put these art and science into a gallery context or hunt down works that are addressing this. But you also, you're the one who's, have one foot inside the whole thing happening here. Would you care to reflect a bit on your perspective in terms of this and share us a bit your thoughts? How do you approach this, both the big picture, but also this concrete stuff that's happening here in plugging
I'm
section?
so excited.
Yeah.
First of all, I have to say this. I'm so excited with speaking with these all distinguished speakers here, because I think this is the first time that we launch this as a debate, collecting and curating new media art, especially in an international art fair environment. I think that's a very interesting debate. I will try to summarize my views, and thank you for all for coming and participating in this debate. I would like to speak a little about what I understand from curating new media art. It's an ongoing research for me, and we say research is a curatorial practice. So I feel like, especially in contemporary Istanbul, with having the experience of working with contemporary Istanbul, I felt like I'm working as an anthropologist, and this is my field, and the exhibition that we are making is an experiment of my research, and it's a different feeling that for a lot of moments I felt like I alienated from the process. So that's why I said contemporary art, new media art, is just like the same, but it's a little different. So I would like to talk about these differences a bit. First of all, in order to make a difference within an international art fair, I would like to, I gave the focus to the technical definition of plugin. Because one of my criticisms is that people use these technical terms as a metaphor, but somehow they empty the processing. I can give you zillions of examples, but I won't. So I started working with the technical definition of plugin, so making an update to a file format. So I've considered contemporary Istanbul as a formatted, as a standard file format. So I wanted to make a supplement to this conventional current status of contemporary art and how it is displayed and how it is shared in Turkey. Although I wanted galleries and collectioners to be the biggest part of this panel. I know that they are really like buying and selling things. It looks like the stock exchange. I can see the view right now from here. That's why the curatorial theme of Plugin New Media section is exchange. So I wanted to ask, like, what kind of alternative ways that we can create to enrich the exchange among different partners and participants, not only with the galleries and the collectioners, because art is not only about art object today, since, not today, since 1920s, for a long time. So what we are trying to do is to open this debate and make a supplement, make a plugin, create a plugin which is processing within the existing structures, so that it would maybe create a little difference and update the current status. So I would like to give two examples within the exhibition in order to further these points. The first one is Bager Akbay's work. I don't know whether you have seen it, but I invite you all especially to become a part of it, part of this research actually. Bager Akbay is working on robot rights. I'm not going to go further in detail, but it is he's talking about research as an artistic process. So he basically designed a robot, an artificial intelligence, which writes its own poems, and he taught his own handwriting, and this is the poem that, and then he gave an identity through the photographs that people use. Share, okay, I couldn't tell. I start from the beginning. People, there's a tabloid newspaper in Turkey, and there's a poem column over there, Yurdumun Şairleri, the poets of my country. So Bager Akbay collected these poems for 2 years and basically write an algorithm and worked on this artificial intelligence who writes his own poems. And then he taught his handwriting and this robot, let's say, function. And he wants to be recognized as a citizen robot. Anyway, and then he curated an identity on Facebook, and now Deniz Yılmaz has thousands of followers. And Deniz Yılmaz wanted his poems to be published, but the newspaper did not publish. This means he did not recognized as a citizen. So as you realize, I'm trying to tell you a really, a story. So the curator becomes a storyteller. Mm. That's what we are trying to do with our relationship with the audience as well. Mm. So that we can give the approach, the research approach of the artists, so that we try to bond and we try to create an organic relationship between the artwork, among the artwork and the artist and his artistic approach. And this is the document that we are using to sell the poems of Deniz Yılmaz in order for him to be recognized as the citizen for the first time in the world. This, I think Haro mentioned perfectly well, and you emphasized as well. While I was working on this section, the political situation in Turkey was so tense, and I felt the responsibility of this situation. That's why we invited Mohsen Allahyari's work, because she worked on the 3D printed version of the destroyed statues, because the ISIS destroyed those statues, as you know, and the concerned people all around the world, including the museologists, archaeologists, historians, or random people, they put all the information that they have collected in a Musul project, in a database, which is a crowdsourcing project. And Mohsen Allahyari used those database, and she reproduced the knowledge. So the collector, let's come back to the function of the collector today. So if the collector buys this work, he would have or she would have the responsibility of preserving the knowledge which is reproduced by the artist. So one other thing that I would like to emphasize for the future of these works, there are some independent organizations that galleries and museums and independent collectors can work for the migration of the file formats. For instance, this has been a big issue. I'm sure Beryl Graham can give an insight for this. This has been, or Haro, of course, this has been a great issue for video, as you know. The file formats have changed, and we had to migrate all those. I can tell from your look. We had to migrate all those file formats from analog to digital. So this is like the same, and when a lot of people and institutions are working on this topic as well. So I call collectors that you are not alone anymore. There are some alternative solutions for this today. I mean, by the beginning of 2000s, this was a very difficult situation, but now it works. There are some systems and mechanisms. And the last point that I would like to make is that now there are workshops, for instance, for the younger generation of digital culture at the moment in the plugin section. So my experience with curation is that the younger generation connect with these works better than us and quicker than us, and they find solutions faster than us. So my investment as a curator and as a researcher is to the younger generation especially, because within 10 years, which is not too much, within 10 years, I think things will change a lot. There's another talk program, walks program, which includes exhibition tours, within a very informal way that we interact with the audience one-to-one. So it is very exciting for me to conduct this research, this field research, and experience the processing within this environment with all of you. So I thank all of you, actually, to become a part of this.
It's really interesting to hear how you kind of approached this as well, and it really resonates with a lot of things that were said. I'm kind of interested in picking up on some of the threads there, and for instance, asking first Haro in terms of, so how do you see this as a collector? On the one hand, this balancing act between specific works that have very concrete sides to them, take the robotic arm and the robotic artificial intelligence, but at the same time driven by a very, let's say, abstract conceptual idea, politically important idea. What are the kind of things that you see when you look at the piece, approaches as a collector, but interested in social issues? Can you just share a couple of words, and then we can also kind of expand on that? Because everybody wants to hear of how does collectors see these things. Art historians see it in a certain way, with theorists and creators see it in a certain way. How do you see it as a collector? Is somewhere there in between, or?
Yeah, that question has a few answers, I think.
Give us the best one.
The best one. Okay, I'll try. The issue is that because of my role at Collector Space, I also interact with other collectors and see their decision-making process, and that also informs my decision-making. So now the answers that I may give you may not be the ones that got me started. Nowadays, I see a collector's role as more of a financer or enabler of works that need production funding.
Yeah. So you're actually a producer as well in certain ways, right?
In some ways, yes. That's what the role that the collector has to fill these days. In terms of what drives me to consider a work to add to the collection, and I have to say I really don't have an obsession to own things, but I understand that that's an avenue of participating in the system and also allowing the system to continue. I always think about, how this particular work will be viewed in the future, in 20 years. Why is this work relevant today? And it might still be relevant when we look at them, given the context that it was produced. What will be the new questions that it may pose? What other interpretations are there other than what we are looking at? The works that I run away from are the one-liners. If I can read the work and I know exactly what it is, it's definitely not what I want.
Not interesting enough.
Yes,
Yeah.
I mean, because that relationship is very limited in terms of, my interest in terms of holding on to it. It has to be multi-layered, and it has to have layers that I can't even see at the moment.
Yeah.
But I trust that they exist.
Yeah. It makes complete sense. These are probably some of the issues that also we reflect. People who work within academia but very in close proximity to the artists. I realize the obvious thing, we do not have an artist kind of speak on here and kind of speaking on the kind of relation they have with collectors.
Yeah.
But we can also, because it's a bundle of people and networks that are relevant here, right? So it's basically, it is this kind of bundle of collectors, artists, galleries, institutions, academic institutions. Where do we fit in terms of academics? We're sort of a producers of certain spaces of visibilities, concepts, practices, possibilities. What are we, where do we fit in terms of the kind of positives here? Public institutions that kind of also support. This is one of the interesting things here as well. Haro's background is, I mean, we usually think of collecting as the private side of things, but at the same time, this is about making things public, right?
Oh yeah, and I think that what's come out of this that's so interesting is, again, the way in which new media is making us recognize functions that we're providing that we might not have recognized before. So that almost like, open source and Linux developers, you've got a network of collectors and producers who are functioning properly as a network, that we have a dispersal now of this work in such a way that you can say, we can pool our resources. If they've managed to upgrade their infrastructure to support this work continuing to be live and available, then you could learn from them. And you as a collector can then say, right, someone else is troubleshooting this. So it's really interesting how these traditional networks of collecting and curating are actually absorbing, its whole IT kind of infrastructure is now very much mirrored by the activities that we are finding ourselves undertaking. And I think that as academics, we are a part of that kind of troubleshooting support network, that we're in there helping to highlight particular practitioners, particular practices, drawing attention to them, bringing together panels like this to ask these kinds of questions that help us to reiterate the functions that we find ourselves performing that we might not have taken the time to recognize so explicitly before, because we were just busy doing them. It's only when you stop to ask yourself, what kind of function are we providing, that you can recognize this rather subtle shift in how the art network is working within new media practices.
True. Beryl, what do you think?
I think this collective action, I think it is very cheering, I think, because collecting used to be very much about one individual taste, but now not only are we crowdsourcing the documentation of work, as we saw, we're also maybe crowdsourcing sort of support for artists. So artists will maybe sell very many things very cheaply. Like Casey Reese has done an edition of works which are very specifically meant to be consumed in domestic settings. So he'll sell little bits of software that you put on your television screen at home, because technology is very domestic. But he'll sell many copies for a small amount rather than one large unique work for thousands of pounds. So this collective action I think is important for lots of different contexts, for curators as well. there's an exhibition at Salford at the moment, the Lowry Gallery, which has been curated by 5 different curators who all met on our London course.
Do you want to pick up on
one
something?
issue that I have is, with any type of art or knowledge production, I worry about the funding, that it can find the funding to be produced in the first place, and different activities have their own funding. Film has a very specific way of making sure that it can draw the money that it needs, and it does need a lot of money. Literature is a different model, and art is basically art fairs, galleries, collectors, so on and so forth. So when we go to a different medium, we have to think about the collectibility of it, because without the collectibility, we may run into trouble in terms of financing the works. And yes, because these works are digital, in most cases they can be distributed easily, they can reach a vast audience, and maybe most critically, the copy is as good as the original. So that idea of originality is a bit questionable. We may want to have crowdfunding type of avenues to fund the works. We have to keep in mind that art is contemporary art. Should not be considered something as a mass consumable good. So if we depend on a lot of people liking what we are doing, as an artist, I'm not an artist, but from that perspective, it will be, I imagine, more difficult to push the envelope, to do things that people don't like at the moment, but eventually they will learn to appreciate it. With the current model, it needs a few crazy people to support, production of an artwork, and that's how the model works. And I don't have the answer in terms of where the balance needs to be. Should we go to the crowds, or should we keep the collector model for this space? But it is one of the critical issues in my mind.
And it clearly seems to be this is a bit of banal observation, but it's an ecosystem of funding models. There's not one, and there never will be, and there never has be, and shouldn't be either in terms of these things.
Ideally.
And that's why it's probably that a lot of us are looking at these things from the perspective that it's a passion. We want to see critical, great work, and we want to work enabling that with various ways in which, through public funding, how it might work in the universities, through collector activities, and then working as a kind of in these settings that are, short term, but at the same time, huge amount of things happening and huge amount of work going into, 3-4 days. And the kind of intensity of the art fair as a kind of a setting for this, right? So
I'd like to share with you 2 things. After the Waves exhibition, I made a small little survey in the exhibition, and someone wrote us a little note, like, why don't you work better? Why don't you work better to make your work more public?
That's nice.
So this was a motivation for me to work with Contemporary Istanbul as well, because 80,000 people is visiting this fair. But at the same time, once again, upon my experience, I try to create a participatory curatorial model in plugin this year. For instance, I have collaborated with Block Art Space for the plugin walks. I have collaborated with Bubi for plugin talks, and Spotter Kids, and Beşiktaş Municipality, and Maker Education Act for the plugin workshops, and many other collaborators. What I've experienced is that once you raise the number of participants, the expectation and the expectation of visibility of the participants raise, and they how do you call that? There's a conflict that you have to solve.
Yeah.
Because I don't know, like one of them tells you that no, my logo should stand here, and then the other one comes like, no, mine should be here, and it's like, no, I have to be at the front, no, I have to be front, and the curation becomes a problem solver here.
A diplomat.
A diplomat, a policymaker, a researcher, an anthropologist, a funding, a producer, it's sometimes a psychologist. My friends, my artist friends were, we were kidding with each other, like my mom, like waking the artists from their beds, like come, because everyone is so exhausted. So I'm really glad that we all experienced this process all together.
Yeah.
So, and
True.
we are still learning all together, because, that's the basic fundamental basis, that we follow the do-it-yourself culture.
Yeah.
And this is basically, I think, what we are doing.
I think that's a good kind of a summary also, that to kind of get a sense of what kind of investment does it take for us to put into curating this, but also in terms of the activities that sustain all of the new media arts that are much more than art on the screen. We're running out of time, but do come talk to us after the panel. If you see us, get in touch if you want to know. And a warm thank you in the traditional way to our panelists today and the audience. Thank you.